Good morning, everyone. You have probably all heard of the name of Julius Caesar before. However, his story is only rarely taught in British schools, despite being an absolutely fundamental part of the history of Western Europe, of the Western world in general. He was the man who destroyed the Roman Republic and contributed to turn it into the Roman Empire. And the title of, for example, the German emperor during World War One, the Kaiser, comes from the word Caesar. The title of the Russian emperor, Tsar, comes from a Russification of the word Caesar. And the figure of Julius Caesar is a figure I've been obsessed with since when I was 13 or 14, to a point that I spent entire days wondering whether history could be changed by a single man or not, and after 20 years of reflections on the subject, I still haven't found an answer. So, today we are going to look at the rise and fall of Gaius Julius Caesar, and we'll try to see the causes and the consequences of his murder. Because, spoiler alert, he died for being stabbed 23 times by his friends and family. In particular, we will look at the following points. So, we'll look at the late Roman Republic, so the Republic at the end of its history. Then we will we'll look at the first Triumvirate, at the Civil War, at the conspiracy to kill Caesar and his murder, of course, and finally at how the Republic turned into an empire. Very briefly, because it's a long story, which we will deal with next week. So, the late Roman Republic. The last time we checked, Rome was a republic, of course, which had been able to conquer most of the Mediterranean coastline thanks to its army of citizen soldiers, with some clever and aggressive diplomacy combined with it. However, by 90 BC, the system was beginning to crumble. The Italian allies of Rome wanted to have the same rights as the population of Rome itself. It's complicated, just go with it. And they went to war, the so-called social war between 91 and 88 BC. It was a terrible conflict which for the first time pitched the Roman armies against the Roman armies, even though one side was technically the Italian allies of Rome. But after 3 years, eventually they were able to obtain them. The disagreements with the Italian allies, however, were not the only threat to social stability during the late Republican period, which is the first and second century BC. The numerous wars fought by the Republic meant that the generals leading its armies were becoming more popular and more powerful. Powerful men who had the loyalty of their own soldiers and who could use them to gain even more power. This trend was made even more relevant when a Roman consul and commander named Gaius Marius decided to enact a military reform, the so-called Marian Reform from his name, which allowed every Roman citizen to become a soldier and serve in the legions, whereas before they were citizens who were called to arms, okay, and only if you were part of the middle classes, we would say now, you were allowed to serve in the army. Now everyone who was born a Roman citizen could serve in the army. This change was made necessary by the large distances that the Roman soldiers were expected to cover now. They were fighting in Spain or in Anatolia, which is now modern Turkey, rather than just a few miles from home, as it had been in the times of the Republic. Therefore, they wouldn't be back home for years. They needed to be professionals. They could not be normal people taken from their jobs, taken from their lives, and sent to fight elsewhere in the world. So, after the Marian reforms, the Roman armies were made up of more or less 100% professional soldiers, but there was a problem. These men were more loyal to their own commanders than to the Roman Republic. Now, the Marian reform contributed to destabilizing the Republic, to making it a lot more chaotic actually, weakening the rule of law and allowing powerful commanders, including Marius himself, to fight against each other for the control of the state. After 50 years of constant infighting, the situation was more or less brought back to normal when then three very powerful men decided to make an agreement that would allow them to control the fate of Roman politics for the decades to come. They were Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, here you see in the middle, a victorious and extremely popular general who had conquered the rich provinces of the Eastern Mediterranean, so Anatolia and Syria, not Egypt though. Then we got Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, who had made a fortune by building and renting cheap houses during a period in which the population of Rome was growing exponentially, reaching about 1 million people. For an ancient city, that's huge. And then we got Gaius Julius Caesar, at the time a young politician with a strong support among the people of Rome. They agreed that no one in the city of Rome would get power without their consent, and made a plan to control all elective offices for the foreseeable future. So they were essentially rigging the elections and checking who was elected and who was not. But they also wanted not just to maintain that, but also to increase their own powers. Pompey, who had already had a successful military career and really had nothing to prove at that stage, remained in Rome to control the Senate and increase his own control of the state. Crassus, on the other hand, craved to be seen as more than just another ruthless builder of cheap housing, and decided to start a war against the kingdom of the Parthians at the eastern border of the Roman Republic. He was ambushed at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, and his army was completely destroyed by the enemy cavalry. We discussed that in the last lesson, resulting in one of Rome's most humiliating defeats. Meanwhile, Caesar, who needed a war to show himself to be a strong military leader and not just an arrogant politician, decided to start a campaign of conquest in Gaul, which is modern France. He also reached Britain. He was the first Roman to actually reach and set foot on the island, but the island would only be conquered later during the reign of Emperor Claudius between 41 and 54 AD, while the Gallic War were between 51 and 59 BC. So there would be more or less a century between Caesar's arrival in Britain and his first fight with the local Britons and Claudius's later conquest of the island. Here we see a picture of the 19th century painting, very famous, about the end of the Gallic War, in which the Gallic chief Vercingetorix surrendered his sword and his authority to Caesar after the terrifying Battle of Alesia. Now, Caesar's conquest in Gaul can either be seen as a masterpiece of military strategy, because if you read the account written by Caesar himself, incidentally, of his strategy and political maneuvering and how he pitched the Gallic tribe one against the other, it was a pretty impressive piece of work. But it could also be seen as a totally unnecessary genocide, because more or less 2 million Gauls died during the conquest, which was huge. Either way, it changed the balance of power in Rome. With Crassus dead at the hands of the Parthians, remember the Battle of Carrhae, and with Caesar now with a strong military history and a strong army behind him, and being fresh from an extraordinarily successful campaign of conquest, Pompey, the other member of the Triumvirate, began to feel threatened. He convinced the Senate to recall back Caesar and demanded that he gave up control of his army. Caesar refused, of course, and crossed the Rubicon, the river that traditionally marked the borders of Roman Italy, an area in which no armies were allowed. He allegedly murmured, "The die is cast, alea iacta est," meaning that there is no going back now while crossing the river. His actions would later start a long and difficult civil war against Pompey and the armies of the Senate, but at the end, Caesar came out victorious over Pompey. The Republic was now in his hands, with no opposition yet. Italian historian Luciano Canfora wrote a fantastic book about Caesar, calling him the democratic dictator. Once Caesar was in power after the Civil War, he began implementing a lot of laws that favored the poor population of the city of Rome. He gave lands to his army veterans, and he reformed many aspects of Roman life. For example, the calendar that we use today is based on the one devised under Caesar. Before then, it was a much different calendar, much different way of understanding months and days and so on. It's pretty important. However, he also centralized all powers in his own person. He proclaimed himself to be dictator for life and forced the Senate to give him many honors. A brief sideline, brief description of what the Romans meant with the word dictator. Now, the Roman Republic was governed by two consuls, so two leaders who governed the Republic. However, in times of emergency, like when, for example, an enemy army was ravaging through Italy, a single person, a dictator, would be given control of the Republic's army and would have pretty much absolute rule. However, the catch was that he would only be allowed to remain in power for 6 months. Because, as we said, the Romans did not like kings, did not like absolute rulers, at least in this phase of their history. And yes, so Caesar, once he ended the civil wars, and once he was back in Rome, he proclaimed himself dictator for life. So it needs to be understood in this context, with this meaning of the word dictator. He also forced, as we said, the Senate to give him more and more honors. For example, the Senate spontaneously renamed the month of his birthday, which was Quintilis in the old Roman calendar, as Julius, in honor of his name, Gaius Julius Caesar. This is the origin of the English word July. You learned something. Now, while Caesar was very careful never to refer to himself as a king, he behaved exactly like one. He dressed like one, he ordered people around like one, and at least, and this was very true, at least in the eyes of the Roman senators, who began a plot to get rid of him. The leader of these conspirators, of these conspiring senators who wanted to kill Caesar, was a man named Marcus Junius Brutus, who was very close to Caesar, who loved him like a son. He and the other senators were concerned that Caesar's rules had turned the Republic into an absolute monarchy, replacing free citizens with subjects. Many important senators were also worried that if Caesar kept centralizing his powers in his own hands, they would lose their own powers as senators. They decided therefore that they needed to get him out of the picture by murdering him. One day, on the 15th of March of 44 BC, the Ides of March, as it was known in the Latin calendar, Caesar went to the Senate. Several people tried to warn him and ask him to stay home, but he didn't listen. The conspirators crowded around him, pretending to show him petitions from the people. One of them pulled his toga. It was the signal. The conspirators took out the knives and started stabbing him. Caesar was hit by 23 stabs, the last of which, according to the legend, came from his beloved Brutus. The Roman historian Suetonius tells us that the great man's dying words were a question for Brutus himself. "You too, my son?" Speaking of which, the words "et tu, Brute," which you might heard, are an invention by William Shakespeare. The ancient sources never mentioned them, and the best I could find was Suetonius saying "you too, my son," but in Greek, "kai su teknon," rather than in Latin, which is also an interesting choice. Still, nevertheless, those were the last words of the dying dictators, allegedly. What happened next? So, the assassination of Caesar sent shockwaves across the Roman world, and is one of the key events of Western civilizations. Caesar's adoptive son, Gaius Octavianus, known as Octavian, which you can see in this statue from my own town of Fano. I very rarely get to talk about it, but here it is. So, eventually Octavian made his bid for power as Caesar's adoptive son. He gathered support and started a victorious war against the conspirators who killed Caesar. Eventually he began and won another civil war against one of Caesar's most trusted commanders, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony. The end of this last civil war with Mark Antony meant that Octavian now had full control over the Roman state. He named himself Princeps, which means the first among equals of the Senate. He was Princeps Senatus, and pretended as if nothing had changed. The Republic had been restored, everything is under control. But the truth was that all the powers of the Roman Republic were now in his hands, and that he had become an absolute and unopposed ruler. One of his first actions was to declare that his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, was a god. and that therefore he was Divi Filius, the son of a god. He had become de facto the first Roman emperor. But that is a story for another time. I hope you like this lesson. I apologize for the background noise. It's just my dryer, and I cannot pause it, unfortunately. So here it is. Looking forward to see what you can write, and see you next time.